If that cabin door closes before the truth arrives, every badge in this terminal will have failed its purpose. The words crackled through the cockpit intercom with such calm authority that every flight attendant froze in place. Every gate agent instinctively looked toward the aircraft, and dozens of passengers already buckled into their seats exchanged confused glances through the oval windows. Flight 482 to Seattle had been scheduled to push back exactly 6 minutes earlier, yet the jet remained motionless beneath the bright afternoon sun as the engines idled with a low, steady hum that vibrated across the concrete apron. At gate C-17, Officer Daniel Brooks stood squarely in front of Marcus Carter, a black traveler wearing a navy sport coat, dark jeans, and a worn leather backpack slung over one shoulder. Marcus had been only a few steps from scanning his boarding pass when Brooks raised a hand and asked him to step aside for additional verification. Marcus complied immediately without protest. Around them, travelers slowed their pace, curiosity spreading faster than any announcement over the terminal speakers. Parents gently pulled children closer. Business travelers glanced impatiently at expensive watches. Vacationers whispered theories they could not possibly verify. Marcus kept both hands visible and maintained the same composed expression that had carried him through years of airports, conferences, and long business trips. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked in a respectful voice. Brooks answered with professional firmness, explaining that something required additional confirmation before Marcus could board. He offered no accusation, only a statement that further review was necessary. Yet the delay instantly transformed Marcus from an ordinary passenger into the unwilling center of attention. The digital departure board continued flashing on time while the boarding lane remained strangely frozen. A flight attendant waiting near the aircraft door checked her headset twice before looking toward the jet bridge with growing concern. Inside the cockpit, Captain Sarah Mitchell reviewed the final passenger manifest one last time. Everything had been routine, until she received a message from the lead gate agent explaining that one traveler had been stopped moments before departure. She expected another simple paperwork issue, the kind that usually resolved within seconds, but when her eyes drifted across the passenger list, one name quietly caught her attention. Marcus Carter. She paused with her hand resting on the throttle checklist, reading the name again as though it belonged to a memory she had not visited in years. Outside, Brooks continued asking measured questions while another officer verified information through official channels. Marcus answered each one clearly, never raising his voice, never showing frustration despite the growing audience around him. He understood that procedures existed for a reason, yet he also knew what it felt like to become the subject of silent assumptions before facts had finished speaking. He watched another family disappear down the jet bridge, then noticed the aircraft door remain open even after the last group should have boarded. A breeze drifted through the terminal entrance as the scent of fresh coffee mixed with jet fuel, and somewhere beyond the glass windows a baggage cart rolled across the ramp with a metallic rattle. Time seemed to stretch. The gate clock advanced another minute. Passengers inside the cabin looked through their windows toward the terminal, wondering why nothing was moving. Then every radio on the gate frequency came alive with the calm, unmistakable voice of Captain Sarah Mitchell. "This is Captain Mitchell. Flight 482 will not close the cabin door until Mr. Marcus Carter is either on this aircraft or the facts are completely verified." An uneasy silence settled over gate C-17, heavier than the noise of the engines waiting outside, and for the first time that afternoon, every person watching realized this delay was about to become something far more important than a missed departure. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. 45 minutes earlier, Marcus Carter stepped through the sliding glass doors of Franklin International Airport with the unhurried confidence of someone who believed that arriving early was a form of respect. A cool stream of conditioned air replaced the humid August afternoon outside as rolling suitcases echoed across polished stone floors beneath high skylights that filled the terminal with soft natural light. He adjusted the strap of his weathered leather backpack and glanced at the departure board. Flight 482 to Seattle remained exactly where he expected it, scheduled to leave in just under 2 hours. He smiled faintly, checked his watch, and continued toward the security checkpoint without rushing. Marcus had taken dozens of business trips over the past decade, yet every airport still reminded him of possibility. Every boarding pass represented another chance to solve a difficult problem, meet new people, and prove that careful work could quietly improve lives without ever making headlines. This trip mattered more than most. The Aerospace Safety Conference in Seattle would gather engineers, airline investigators, maintenance directors, and flight operations specialists from across the country. Marcus had been invited to present research on improving inspection procedures that could prevent costly mechanical oversights before they became emergencies. He had spent nearly 8 months refining every chart, every recommendation, and every real-world example until each slide reflected the same principle that guided his entire career. Details mattered because people depended on them. Before joining the security line, he stopped at a neighborhood coffee stand tucked beside a bookstore. The cashier recognized him from earlier visits and greeted him with a warm smile. Marcus ordered a medium black coffee and a turkey sandwich for the flight, thanked the cashier by name, and slipped an extra few dollars into the tip jar before walking away. Kindness had never been something he performed for attention. It was simply the way his parents had raised him. His mother often reminded him that character revealed itself most clearly in ordinary moments when nobody expected anything in return. As he approached the checkpoint, his phone vibrated gently. A photograph of his younger sister, Naomi, appeared on the screen beside an incoming message wishing him good luck before tomorrow's presentation. Marcus replied with a short promise to call after landing, then slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket. He knew his family believed in him long before conference organizers or industry executives ever noticed his work, and that quiet support had carried him through years when recognition arrived slowly. Beyond security, the terminal buzzed with the familiar rhythm of modern travel. Flight announcements echoed overhead. Children laughed near oversized windows while watching airplanes taxi across the runway. Travelers hurried toward distant gates with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Others settled into comfortable chairs with newspapers, novels, or laptops balanced across their knees. Marcus found gate C-17 nearly empty, chose a seat overlooking the aircraft, and opened his tablet one final time to review his presentation. He was not memorizing facts anymore. He was reminding himself why every recommendation mattered. Behind every maintenance checklist stood families waiting for loved ones to come home safely. Behind every technical report stood real people trusting strangers they would never meet. After several quiet minutes, boarding finally began. Marcus closed the tablet, placed it carefully inside his backpack, and joined the line with the same calm patience he had shown all morning. He greeted the gate agent with a polite smile while reaching for his boarding pass, completely unaware that within the next few moments an unexpected interruption would place him at the center of a situation that would test not only his composure, but also the integrity and judgment of everyone around him. The line moved forward one passenger at a time until Marcus Carter stood only a few feet from the boarding scanner, the soft electronic chime repeating every few seconds as travelers disappeared down the jet bridge. The atmosphere remained calm, almost routine, with quiet conversations blending into overhead announcements about departing flights and weather conditions across the country. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, removed his boarding pass together with his government-issued identification, and offered both to the gate agent with a friendly smile. Before she could scan either document, Officer Daniel Brooks approached from the side of the boarding lane with measured confidence. His uniform was neat, his posture disciplined, and his expression reflected the certainty of someone who believed every decision had to be made quickly before uncertainty created larger problems. Brooks had spent nearly 12 years working airport security. During that time, he had developed a reputation among his colleagues for noticing details others sometimes overlooked. He trusted procedures, instincts, and immediate action, often believing that hesitation carried greater risk than temporary inconvenience. Earlier that afternoon, another officer had mentioned a routine notification involving travel documents that required additional verification for one passenger with a similar first name. The information was incomplete, and the verification process was still active, but Brooks decided he would personally confirm everything before allowing anyone matching the notification to continue. As Marcus stepped toward the scanner, Brooks politely raised one hand. "Sir, may I ask you to step over here for just a moment?" His tone remained professional, neither hostile nor aggressive. Marcus looked briefly toward the boarding bridge before turning back, with complete cooperation. "Of course, officer. Is there something I can help clarify?" Brooks accepted the identification card and studied it carefully. His eyes moved from the document to Marcus, then back again. Around them, the boarding line slowed almost immediately. The gate agent glanced toward Brooks, waiting for instruction before continuing to process passengers. A family standing several feet behind Marcus quietly shifted their carry-on luggage while two business travelers exchanged puzzled looks without saying a word. Brooks spoke into his shoulder radio, requesting confirmation from another department while continuing to examine the identification. Nothing in Marcus's behavior suggested impatience. He stood comfortably with both hands visible, his backpack resting beside one polished shoe. "I understand procedures have to be followed," Marcus said calmly. "If you need additional information, I will gladly provide it." Brooks appreciated the cooperation, yet something continued to bother him. The partial notification remained unresolved, and in his experience, incomplete information demanded caution rather than assumption. He requested another verification, this time asking dispatch to compare several identification numbers before boarding continued. Minutes passed. The electronic boarding chime stopped entirely. Travelers who had already entered the aircraft settled into their seats, while those still waiting near the gate quietly wondered what had caused the unexpected delay. Sunlight reflected across the terminal windows, casting long bands of gold across the polished floor as airport employees continued moving through the concourse with practiced efficiency. Marcus noticed none of the frustration directed toward him. Instead, he maintained steady eye contact with Brooks and spoke with quiet respect. "Officer, I appreciate that you have a responsibility to perform. I only ask that everything be verified completely before any conclusions are reached." Brooks gave a brief nod, but did not respond immediately. He remained convinced that completing every available check before allowing Marcus to board was the correct decision. Neither man realized that inside the cockpit, Captain Sarah Mitchell had just finished reading the passenger manifest for a second time, and one familiar name had already begun changing the course of the afternoon. Marcus remained exactly where Officer Daniel Brooks had asked him to stand, only a few feet from the boarding lane, while another security officer quietly compared information through official airport systems. The terminal continued moving around them with the steady rhythm of afternoon departures, but a small circle of attention had begun to form without anyone intending it. Travelers who had once been focused only on finding their seats now found themselves watching the delayed boarding process unfold in uneasy silence. The gate agent glanced repeatedly between the computer screen and the officer, unsure whether to continue calling additional passengers or wait for instructions. Brooks listened carefully to short responses coming through his radio, each one providing only part of the information he wanted. One database confirmed Marcus's identity. Another verification request remained incomplete. A similar name had appeared earlier in an internal notification, and although several details no longer seemed to match, Brooks believed allowing the process to finish was the safest course of action. Experience had taught him that assumptions could create problems. Yet on this afternoon, his determination to eliminate every uncertainty had begun slowing everything around him. Marcus noticed the growing tension but refused to let it shape his own behavior. He offered another calm smile and gently placed his backpack on the polished floor beside him. "Officer, if there is anything else you need from me, I will gladly cooperate," he said. "I only hope the verification can rely on confirmed facts rather than incomplete information." Brooks looked up briefly before returning his attention to the identification card still resting in his hand. "I appreciate your patience, sir. We are waiting for one final response." Behind them, a father quietly reassured his young daughter that the airplane would leave soon. Two elderly travelers exchanged concerned looks before returning to their newspapers. A flight attendant standing near the aircraft door adjusted her headset for the third time, listening to updates from operations while keeping one eye on the boarding bridge. The delay had now stretched several more minutes beyond the expected departure sequence. Inside the cockpit, Captain Sarah Mitchell completed another communication with ground operations. Fuel numbers had been confirmed. Weather along the route remained favorable. Every departure item showed ready except one line highlighted in yellow on her operations display. Passenger boarding incomplete. Sarah requested the reason. The dispatcher answered that one traveler remained under additional verification at the gate. Name? Sarah asked almost automatically. There was a brief pause before the reply came through her headset. Marcus Carter. Sarah's hand stopped moving across the checklist. She leaned back slightly, repeating the name under her breath. It was impossible to mistake. Years earlier, she had attended a federal aviation safety workshop after an engine inspection review revealed a hidden maintenance risk affecting several aircraft models. One young systems engineer had calmly identified the overlooked pattern before anyone else recognized its significance. His recommendations had eventually become part of updated inspection procedures adopted by multiple carriers. Sarah still remembered the presentation because the engineer never spoke about recognition or awards. He spoke only about protecting passengers who would never know their lives had been made safer. She reached for the passenger manifest again, comparing the birth date with the information she remembered. It matched. Outside the cockpit windows, the open cabin door framed the bright terminal corridor where ground crews continued waiting for clearance to disconnect equipment. Sarah pressed the communications switch once more, her voice composed but unmistakably firm. Ground operations, this is Captain Mitchell. I want the boarding status updated immediately. No one closes this aircraft until every verification concerning Mr. Marcus Carter is complete and personally confirmed. Across Gate C-17, conversations faded almost instantly. Even Officer Brooks slowly lowered his radio, realizing the request had come directly from the captain herself. And for the first time that afternoon, he began wondering whether the man standing quietly before him might be someone whose story had not yet been fully understood. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The silence that followed Captain Sarah Mitchell's transmission felt heavier than the steady vibration of the aircraft waiting beyond the terminal windows. Officer Daniel Brooks stood motionless for a brief moment, his radio still resting in his hand as every conversation around Gate C-17 seemed to dissolve into quiet curiosity. He had expected another routine verification, not a direct instruction from the captain herself to keep an entire aircraft waiting for one passenger. Brooks slowly pressed the communication button again and requested the most current status from the verification center. This time he listened without interrupting, his expression becoming more thoughtful with every passing second. Marcus Carter remained exactly where he had been asked to stand. He neither complained nor looked toward the growing crowd gathering near the boarding lane. Instead, he glanced through the wide, terminal windows at the aircraft resting beneath the afternoon sun, its white fuselage reflecting bright streaks of light across the concrete ramp. The engines continued their low, patient hum, ready for departure whenever permission finally came. A young gate agent quietly approached Marcus with a bottle of water. "Sir, I am sorry for the delay," she said softly. Marcus accepted it with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. I know everyone here has a responsibility. I only hope the facts arrive before assumptions become permanent." The simple sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Several nearby travelers looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with how quickly ordinary uncertainty could become public attention. A businessman who had earlier checked his watch with visible frustration quietly closed his laptop. An elderly woman folded her boarding pass between careful fingers and whispered to her husband. He has been respectful this entire time. Neither of them knew Marcus, yet they had watched enough to recognize patience that could not be faked. Inside the cockpit, Sarah continued studying the passenger manifest, while another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. Years earlier, during the Aviation Safety Symposium, Marcus had finished his presentation with a statement she had never forgotten. He had said that every overlooked detail eventually became someone else's emergency. Safety, he believed, depended on people having the courage to question incomplete information before irreversible decisions were made. Sarah understood the irony immediately. That same principle now applied not to an aircraft system, but to the man himself. She contacted operations once again. "Has the verification been completed?" she asked. Almost, Captain, came the reply. We are waiting for one final database synchronization. Sarah answered without hesitation. Then we continue waiting. Outside the cockpit, flight attendants reassured seated passengers that departure would be delayed only briefly while an operational matter was resolved. No additional explanation followed, and none was necessary. Professionalism replaced speculation inside the cabin. Back at the gate, Brooks finally received another message through his radio. He listened carefully, asked 2 follow-up questions, then requested written confirmation instead of relying only on verbal communication. For the first time that afternoon, uncertainty began giving way to evidence. The original notification involved another traveler whose identification differed in both birth date and document number. The similarity existed only in part of the name. Brooks felt a quiet weight settle across his shoulders. His caution had been sincere, yet caution without complete verification had delayed an innocent passenger and an entire commercial flight. He looked toward Marcus, who still stood with calm dignity despite becoming the focus of dozens of unfamiliar eyes. Brooks walked several measured steps closer. Before he spoke, another secure message appeared on the handheld device clipped to his belt. He opened it immediately, read every line twice, and exhaled slowly. The final confirmation had arrived, and with it came a truth that would change the direction of the entire afternoon. Officer Daniel Brooks lowered the handheld device slowly, reading the final confirmation one last time before locking the screen. The verification was complete. Every identification number matched. Every travel document had been authenticated. The earlier notification belonged to another traveler entirely, someone whose partial name resemblance had created the initial concern, but whose personal information shared nothing else with Marcus Carter. The uncertainty that had justified caution no longer existed. For several long seconds, Brooks simply stood there, listening to the distant hum of aircraft engines outside the terminal and the soft rolling sound of suitcase wheels crossing polished floors. The airport continued functioning exactly as it had before, yet something inside the small space surrounding gate C-17 had quietly changed. Brooks walked toward Marcus with measured steps, his shoulders no longer carrying the certainty they had only minutes earlier. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice calm and professional, "the verification has been completed. Your documents are fully confirmed. You are cleared to board." Marcus accepted the return of his identification with both hands and gave a small nod instead of celebrating. "Thank you for completing the process thoroughly," he replied. There was no bitterness in his voice, only steady composure. Brooks looked at him for another moment before speaking again. "I appreciate your patience." Marcus smiled gently. Patience is easier when people are willing to keep searching for the truth. Those words settled over the gate more heavily than anyone expected. The nearby passengers who had quietly observed the entire delay looked toward Marcus with different expressions now. Some smiled politely. Others simply lowered their eyes, reflecting on how quickly first impressions could outrun verified facts. Inside the aircraft, Captain Sarah Mitchell finally received the updated message she had been waiting for. Passenger verification completed. Cleared for boarding. She released a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding and closed the electronic checklist resting beside her seat. Looking through the open cockpit door toward the jet bridge, she stood and quietly stepped into the forward galley. The lead flight attendant looked surprised to see her leave the cockpit before departure. "Captain," she asked softly. Sarah answered with a calm smile. "There is someone I would like to welcome personally." A few moments later, Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge, the enclosed walkway carrying the familiar scent of conditioned air mixed with faint traces of aviation fuel drifting from the ramp below. His footsteps echoed gently against the metal floor as sunlight streamed through narrow windows overlooking the waiting aircraft. Every step felt unhurried. Every sound seemed unusually clear. When he reached the aircraft entrance, he stopped in quiet surprise. Captain Sarah Mitchell was standing beside the open cabin door herself. Her crisp navy uniform reflected the afternoon light, and her welcoming expression carried unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Carter," she said warmly, extending her hand. "I hoped it was you." Marcus looked at her for a brief second before recognition appeared in his own eyes. "Captain Mitchell," he answered with a genuine smile. "It has been a long time." Sarah shook his hand firmly. Long enough for the entire aviation industry to benefit from your work. Marcus gave a modest laugh. I only shared what the data showed. Sarah gently shook her head. You shared what others overlooked, and because of that, countless passengers have traveled more safely than they will ever know. The nearby flight attendants exchanged curious glances, suddenly realizing the quiet traveler they had watched waiting at the gate was someone their captain clearly respected. Behind Marcus, Officer Brooks observed the brief conversation from the terminal entrance. He did not interrupt. Instead, he remained still, watching respect replace misunderstanding without a single raised voice. In that quiet moment, the brightest sound inside the aircraft was not the engines preparing for departure, but the simple silence that follows when truth finally arrives before the cabin door closes. Marcus followed Captain Sarah Mitchell into the cabin as the quiet murmur of waiting passengers slowly returned to life. Some smiled politely as he passed. Others simply watched with thoughtful expressions, sensing they had witnessed something more meaningful than an ordinary travel delay. Sarah remained beside him for another moment before speaking, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had earned the trust of countless crews throughout her career. There is something I have wanted to tell you for years, she said. Marcus looked at her with genuine curiosity. I always assumed the report disappeared into another government archive. Sarah smiled gently. It almost did, until your presentation changed everything. She glanced briefly toward the cockpit before continuing. 8 years ago, I was flying one of the aircraft models your team studied. We did not know a certain inspection sequence could miss early signs of metal fatigue. Your research proved that the problem was not the aircraft itself. It was the order in which technicians were being asked to inspect it. Marcus lowered his eyes modestly. The maintenance crews were doing their jobs correctly. The checklist simply needed to ask the right questions. Sarah nodded immediately. Exactly. Most people only noticed the final recommendation. You noticed the people behind it. The lead flight attendant listened quietly from several feet away, surprised by the conversation unfolding near the aircraft door. Sarah continued. After your findings were adopted, inspection procedures changed across multiple fleets. Airlines avoided expensive failures. More importantly, passengers arrived home safely without ever knowing why. Marcus gave the familiar humble smile that had followed him throughout his career. That was always the goal. Sarah folded her hands calmly. Do you know how many times pilots have benefited from your work without ever knowing your name? Marcus laughed softly. Probably the same number of times engineers benefit from pilots making the right decisions. Sarah's smile widened. That sounds exactly like the man I remembered. Back inside the terminal, Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing near gate C-17, replaying the afternoon in his mind. His supervisor had already reviewed the completed verification and confirmed that Brooks had followed required procedures by requesting additional checks. Yet the supervisor also reminded him of something equally important. Verification exists to replace uncertainty, the supervisor said quietly. Once the facts arrive, they must become louder than first impressions. Brooks nodded slowly. Those words stayed with him as he watched Marcus disappear into the aircraft. He realized that professionalism was measured not only by caution, but also by the willingness to recognize when caution had reached its proper conclusion. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats while the flight attendants completed the final preparations for departure. Sarah turned toward Marcus one last time before returning to the cockpit. Would you mind waiting here for just another minute? She asked. There is something I would like the crew to hear. Marcus looked surprised but agreed. Moments later, Sarah addressed the cabin through the public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience this afternoon. Before we depart, I would like to recognize one of our passengers. Mr. Marcus Carter has dedicated his career to improving aviation safety. Many of the inspection standards that help protect modern flights today were strengthened because professionals like him chose careful truth over convenient assumptions. Most passengers will never know his name, but many have benefited from his work. The cabin became completely still. Several passengers looked toward Marcus with quiet admiration before gentle applause began near the middle rows. It spread naturally through the aircraft, not because anyone had been asked to participate, but because gratitude often required no invitation. Marcus stood respectfully beside his seat, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention, yet deeply moved by the unexpected recognition. Through the open cabin door, he caught one final glimpse of Officer Daniel Brooks standing quietly at the gate. Their eyes met for only a second. Marcus responded with a small, sincere nod, and Brooks returned it with equal respect, understanding that true dignity had never depended on winning an argument. It had always depended on allowing truth to arrive before judgment reached its destination. The cabin settled into a peaceful stillness as Captain Sarah Mitchell returned to the cockpit, but before the aircraft door could finally close, she asked the lead flight attendant to wait one more moment. She stepped back into the entrance of the aircraft and looked toward the terminal where Officer Daniel Brooks was still standing beside the gate podium. Through the open doorway, she gave him a small nod, inviting him forward if he wished. Brooks hesitated for only a second before walking slowly down the short section of the jet bridge. His expression no longer carried the certainty that had marked the beginning of the afternoon. Instead, it reflected quiet reflection and the humility that sometimes follows an honest mistake. When he reached the aircraft entrance, he stopped a respectful distance from Marcus Carter. The surrounding passengers instinctively fell silent again, sensing that another important moment was about to unfold. Brooks spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear, but his words were directed only to Marcus. "Mr. Carter, today I allowed incomplete information to keep me from seeing the complete person standing in front of me. My responsibility is to protect people through careful verification, but I also have a responsibility to recognize the truth when it arrives. I am sincerely sorry for the delay and for the experience you endured while I completed that process." The apology was simple. There were no excuses and no attempt to shift responsibility elsewhere. Marcus looked at Brooks for a quiet moment before answering. "Officer, every profession carries difficult decisions. Engineers make them. Pilots make them. Security officers make them. What defines us is not whether we face difficult moments. It is what we choose to learn after them." Brooks lowered his eyes briefly, absorbing every word. "I will remember that," he replied. Marcus extended his hand without hesitation. Brooks accepted it gratefully, and the handshake lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried a weight that no speech could have replaced. It was not a victory over another person. It was a victory over pride. Several passengers smiled softly, while others quietly returned to their seats with thoughtful expressions. Captain Mitchell watched the exchange with visible appreciation. Before speaking one final time, "Aviation has always depended on trust," she said. "Trust between crews, mechanics, controllers, inspectors, and passengers. That trust becomes stronger whenever people choose truth over assumptions and respect over pride." Marcus nodded gently. "Kindness is never a substitute for accountability," he said. "But accountability works best when it is guided by fairness." The words settled over the aircraft like warm afternoon light filtering through the cabin windows. Brooks thanked both Marcus and Captain Mitchell before stepping back onto the jet bridge. This time, as he walked toward the terminal, his pace was slower than before, not because he carried regret alone, but because he also carried a lesson he knew would remain with him throughout the rest of his career. Inside the cockpit, Captain Mitchell completed the final checklist. The aircraft door closed with a quiet, reassuring sound. Moments later, the pushback tug gently guided the airplane away from the gate, and the terminal slowly drifted behind them. Marcus settled into his seat beside the window, watching the sunlight stretch across the runway as the aircraft taxied toward departure. He thought about how quickly misunderstandings could grow, but also how quickly they could begin to heal when people were willing to listen, verify, and admit when they were wrong. Beyond the glass, the airport continued welcoming new travelers, each carrying a different story that strangers could never fully understand at first glance. Marcus smiled faintly as the aircraft turned toward the runway. Some journeys begin long before takeoff, and sometimes the most important destination is not the city printed on a boarding pass, but the quiet place where respect finally replaces assumption and character speaks louder than appearances. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story. The aircraft climbed steadily above the clouds as the late afternoon sun painted long ribbons of gold across the horizon, transforming the cabin windows into quiet mirrors that reflected thoughtful faces instead of hurried travelers. The engines settled into their smooth, cruising rhythm, and for the first time that day, there was nothing left to interrupt the journey. Marcus Carter rested his notebook on the tray table without opening it. The presentation he had prepared for months suddenly felt less important than the lesson the afternoon had already written without a single slide. Across the aisle, an elderly passenger smiled warmly before returning to her novel. A young father helped his son look through the window at the blanket of white clouds stretching beyond the wing. Ordinary moments quietly resumed, reminding Marcus that life often continued long after difficult experiences ended, carrying with it the opportunity to choose what kind of memory would remain. Nearly 3 hours later, the aircraft touched down in Seattle with a gentle landing that drew a few relieved smiles from passengers who always appreciated a smooth arrival. As travelers gathered their belongings, Captain Sarah Mitchell stood near the cockpit once more, thanking each passenger for flying with her crew. When Marcus reached the front of the cabin, she handed him a small envelope. "You forgot this years ago," she said with a knowing smile. Marcus looked surprised as he opened it. Inside was a copy of the handwritten note he had placed beside his original aviation safety report after the conference where they first met. He had almost forgotten writing it. The single sentence read, "The safest flight is the one that never has to become tomorrow's headline." Sarah watched him quietly. "I kept a copy because those words reminded me why every checklist matters." Marcus smiled with genuine gratitude before carefully placing the note back into the envelope. "Thank you for remembering," she answered softly. "Thank you for giving us something worth remembering." Back at Franklin International Airport, Officer Daniel Brooks finished his shift long after Flight 482 had disappeared into the western sky. Before leaving, he opened his incident report and added one final paragraph documenting that the verification had been completed successfully and that the passenger had cooperated respectfully throughout the entire process. Then he included a recommendation for additional training emphasizing the importance of distinguishing incomplete alerts from confirmed information before allowing assumptions to shape interactions. No one required him to write those final sentences. He chose to write them because professionalism meant improving tomorrow after learning from today. Weeks later, Marcus delivered his presentation before hundreds of aviation professionals. During the question and answer session, someone asked him what the greatest challenge in aviation safety really was. The audience expected a technical answer involving engineering, inspections, or advanced systems. Instead, Marcus paused for a moment and replied, "The greatest safety tool we have is the willingness to keep looking until the truth is complete. Machines depend on accurate data, and people deserve the same care." The room became completely still before quiet applause gradually filled the conference hall. Many listeners later remembered that answer more clearly than any chart or statistic he presented. Months passed, but Captain Sarah Mitchell and Officer Daniel Brooks each carried the memory of that afternoon in different ways. Sarah continued greeting passengers with the same quiet respect she had always believed every traveler deserved. Brooks became known among newer officers not for acting the fastest, but for insisting that every important decision deserved complete verification before reaching a conclusion. Neither spoke often about the delayed flight, yet both understood its lasting value. Somewhere above another city, another crew prepared another aircraft for departure. Somewhere inside another airport, another traveler waited patiently with hopes, responsibilities, and loved ones expecting a safe return home. Most people would never know Marcus Carter's name, just as they would never know the countless professionals quietly protecting them every single day. But the lesson remained, carried forward in silent choices rather than dramatic moments. Respect grows stronger when it is shared freely. Integrity becomes visible when no one is watching. And sometimes the most powerful journey does not begin when an airplane leaves the ground. It begins the moment someone chooses to let truth arrive before judgment, kindness before pride, and humanity before assumption.